It was generally agreed in the better tea shops of Piccadilly that the late Mr. Aloysius Venn had died in the most inconsiderate fashion possible. To be struck dead in St. James's Park by a falling branch during a morning walk was one thing. To be discovered face down upon the gravel path with his own umbrella snapped neatly in two beside him was quite another. Londoners, being sensitive to the absurd, found the detail about the umbrella particularly distasteful. Death might be tragic, but it need not be comic. When Lord Peter Wimsey first heard the tale, he was standing in the smoking room of his club, surveying a half-empty glass of claret as though it had personally disappointed him. A junior barrister, red about the ears with excitement, burst in to declare that some poor fellow had been done in by lightning, no by accident, no by some queer business, with an umbrella. It was at this point that Wimsey's monocle, which often threatened to drop at inconvenient moments, settled firmly into place. "Umbrella?" he murmured, in the tone of one who has just encountered an exquisite absurdity. "My dear fellow, umbrellas are not weapons of mass destruction, unless, of course, they are German." He paused, lit a cigarette with delicate fuss, and added, "Pray enlighten me as to whether the umbrella was furled or unfurled at the time of its decease." The barrister, somewhat dashed, confessed he did not know. By the following morning, newspapers had seized upon the incident with their usual appetite for the ridiculous. A gentleman's last walk. Curious object found beside body. The curious object was naturally the umbrella, snapped, curiously bent at the handle, and stained with an indelicate splash of mud which no one had yet explained. The coroner, meanwhile, muttered darkly about heart seizures, while the constabulary were content to call it an accident and order a decent burial. It was at this precise moment that Wimsey, with that perverse instinct for trouble which was both his gift and his curse, decided to stroll down to the Venn household in Bloomsbury. He did so ostensibly to pay his respects, but in truth because the phrase "broken umbrella" had lodged in his mind with the persistence of a badly played violin note. Mrs. Venn received him in a drawing-room so heavily curtained it seemed to weep velvet tears. She was pale, composed, and distinctly reluctant to answer questions. Her maid, however, when cross-examined by Wimsey with a charm so dry it might have been imported from the Sahara, let slip that Mr. Venn had quarrelled bitterly the night before with his nephew, a disagreeable young man with a fondness for late hours and speculative investments. By the time Wimsey left the house, he was humming a fragment of Bach under his breath and remarking to Bunter that umbrellas were curious fellows altogether, half a shield, half a sword, and wholly untrustworthy. Thus the game was afoot. Bunter, who had stood throughout the interview with that grave impersonality which makes one suspect him of being an ecclesiastical carving in evening dress, closed the door upon Mrs. Venn with the propriety of a butler extinguishing a scandal. In the taxi, he produced, as if from the lining of the vehicle, a small notebook and a pencil with an immaculate point. "If I might observe, my lord," he ventured, "there is a certain want of harmony between the deceased gentleman's habits as described by the maid, and the presence of mud upon the umbrella." "Want of harmony," said Wimsey, regarding St. James's Park through the window and speaking as though to the Admiralty, "is the source of every charming dissonance in life. We will go and hear the rest of the movement." They alighted at the Horse Guard's end and strolled into the park with the air of persons seeking swans for philosophical conversation. A uniformed constable directed them to the precise gravel path where Mr. Aloysius Venn had elected to conclude his earthly promenade. The morning had the unctuous brightness of a print after Frith. Nannies propelled perambulators with that seriousness which marks a calling rather than a pastime. Sparrows were making professional inquiries into the crumbs of yesterday's buns. The path itself was perfectly ordinary, which to Whimsy recommended it at once. He paused, peered, and dropped to a crouch with an elegance that suggested he had rehearsed the motion in the presence of critics. "There is gravel," he said, "which has been trodden by something heavier than propriety and less delicate than a governess, and there, observe, where the sharper grit has scored the surface of a wooden object dragged a few inches. No branch fell here last night, unless the trees have taken to sandpaper." The constable coloured slightly. "We didn't say as a branch had fell, my lord. Some of the papers—" "Do the thinking, so we need not," murmured Whimsy. "Just so. Was there any fallen timber at all?" The constable indicated the surrounding trees with a deprecating hand. "Keeper says not so much as a twig worth mentioning. Weather was dry, no wind to speak of." "Then it remains," said Whimsy, "to speak of other matters." "Who found the body?" "Mrs. Delahaye, nurse by occupation with a pram. About 20 minutes past 7, she called to a gentleman just ahead, didn't stop. A park keeper came up. Doctor from a house in Birdcage Walk was sent for. Life extinct." The constable's recital had the practised cadence of Sunday lessons. "No signs of robbery. Watch and chain present. Wallet with notes." "And the umbrella?" "Alongside the deceased, broken." "Furled or unfurled?" asked Whimsy, as one inquires whether a musical instrument was in tune at the moment of catastrophe. "Furled when we saw it," said the man, "but the silk was marked inside with a splash of mud, as if it had been up and taken something from below." "Funny that." "Funny," agreed Whimsy, "in the precise Johnsonian sense of provocative of reflection rather than laughter. Bunter, be so good." Bunter had already stepped off the path and was making a courteous inspection of the turf beyond, like a man choosing a pew. He returned with a pinch of something in an envelope which, produced by conjuring, could have concealed a troop of cavalry. "The mud is not of the path, my lord," he reported, "nor of yesterday's gentle watering of flower beds. It has the greyish character of London clay under lake water, and a faint odour of weeds. I should judge it had been slopped from the margin, perhaps by a boisterous waterfowl. There is a great deal of activity this season." "Geese," said Whimsy, "do not murder, though they frequently libel. But they splash. If our umbrella went to meet them, it was to no devotional purpose. Did the deceased have any habit of feeding the birds?" The constable shook his head. "Keeper says the gentleman passed regular between 7 and half past, brisk walker, never dawdled by the water, every morning, rain or no." "Regularity," said Whimsy, straightening, "is a vice cultivated by saints and criminals, and appreciated only after their removal. If Mr. Venn deviated to the lake this morning, something drew him." They were joined then by a gentleman of mild expression, and the moustaches which nature bestows upon one in anticipation of municipal office. He announced himself as Sergeant Knott, who had the case by favour of the local station, and by a more dubious favour the interest of the newspapers. He received Whimsy with a conscientious bow. "Inspector Parker spoke of you, my lord," said Knott. "He rang from the yard. We've no objection to your looking." "Charles is vastly obliging," said Whimsy. "He has the intelligence to make a nuisance of me at other people's expense. What says the doctor?" "Natural causes, most likely," returned Knott, not enjoying the words. "A weak heart. A man of his age. Sudden failure." "With a broken umbrella," said Whimsy. Knott sighed. "That, my lord, is nasty. The shaft snapped near the lower rib joint, the handles bent, as if someone had tugged at it. Might have been trod on in the confusion, if he fell across it." "Ah," said Whimsy sweetly, "the affectionate embrace of fate. And yet the inside mud mark, pray, have you the article convenient?" They walked together to a small lodge where the umbrella lay on a table as reverently as a family relic. It was a brown silk, well-made thing of the sort a conscientious man buys once and condemns his heirs to inherit. The fracture was clean, the varnished cane showing pale at the wound. The curved handle, horn, with a discreet monogrammed silver band, showed a flatness along the inside curve, as if forced against a hard edge. Whimsy flicked the silk with a fingernail and considered the fan of ribs. Inside, upon one panel, a dried splash of pale clay formed a crescent just within the hem. Inside, note, he murmured. A splash from below, caught when the canopy stood between mud and the heavens. Therefore, at some moment, this morning, the umbrella was open. We have had no rain, and Mr. Venn was no sentimentalist about sun. Why then does a man open an umbrella on a dry morning? To shield himself from what? From whom? Bird muck, offered Not, with the honesty of a practical mind. Possible, admitted Whimsy, and discouraging to romance, but you will then look for the complementary stain without. A guano tragedy is seldom discreet. Bunter? No such evidence, my lord. Then let us be sceptical of the avian, said Whimsy. What of witnesses? Not consulted his notebook. Nurse saw a man in a grey hat pass the bench by the lake about 7:15. No description, but city-looking and thin. She heard a crack a few minutes later, thought it a stick. Another lady, Miss Bligh, walking a small dog, saw the deceased on the path with a gentleman talking, no, arguing, she says, on the far side of the shrubbery. She didn't see faces. The shrubbery is a nuisance that way. Shrubberies, said Whimsy cheerfully, were invented to protect innocence and encourage guilt. Did Miss Bligh remember colours? She says the other gentleman wore a dark coat and had a pale scarf. She noticed the scarf because the dog fancied it. Also, Not hesitated with the air of a man presenting unripe fruit. She says there was a woman standing by the iron bridge for some time in a green coat, looking towards the path, then away. She might have no connection. On the contrary, said Whimsy, she has all the connection one can desire until she is found and proves dull. Bunter, we will acquire a green coat in due time. Meanwhile, Sergeant, may I be impertinent and ask at what hour the deceased left his house? Just after 7, said Not. Maid saw him go, breakfast at 7:30 when he returned from his walk, so she says. Habit. He didn't return. Just so, said Whimsy. Then our window is narrow. From 7 to 20 past he walks, deviates to the lake, opens his umbrella, shuts it again, argues with a gentleman of unmemorable features, in a dark coat with a pale scarf, is overheard, and collapses upon the gravel with an instrument conveniently broken at his side. And we are invited to respect the decencies and say, Heart, I am shaken in my orthodoxy. Not looked grateful, as a man secretly relieved of dogma. There is also, my lord, the question of last night. We've a statement from the maid at Bloomsbury of a quarrel with the nephew, Mr. Horace Venn. Loud voices were heard. Mr. Horace left about 11. He denies anything but words. Whimsy smiled mildly. Words, Sergeant, are loaded when fired from family guns. What is young Mr. Horace's occupation? Speculation, he says. There's a club in Holborn, continuation brokers and the like. He owes money. He has expectations under the uncle's will, though not as much as he imagined. Who told him that? The uncle, said Not, last week. Then Mr. Horace has had time to be angry, to repent, and to be angry again, said Whimsy. I do not, however, relish the character of the obvious. The obvious is a draught that goes straight to the head and incapacitates sobriety. We will drink water. Where is Charles now? At the yard, said Not. He asked me to mention he'd be glad of any observations. Charles, said Whimsy. collects observations as misers collect stamps. Kindly inform him that the inside of Mr. Venn's umbrella is muddy and his heart insufficiently so, that a gentleman with a pale scarf argues like a Greek chorus among the laurels, and that a lady in a green coat provides the colour scheme. Bunter, take 2 samples of the clay, the one from the umbrella, the other from the lake margin. Label them in a hand legible even to experts. We may be reduced to the microscope, that humble critic of human nature. They walked to the water's edge. The margin exhibited the usual scandal of ducks, their plopping industry attended by a smell which suggested that the lake had been cooked too long. Bunter, kneeling, collected his scrapings with the exactitude of a sacristan. Whimsy, gazing across the water, watched a woman in a greenish garment pause upon the bridge, glance left and right, and pass on. He laughed softly. "London," he said, "is a vast theatre where the cast changes too quickly for the play. Come, Bunter, we will borrow the good sergeant's patience no longer. I desire, before luncheon corrupts my judgment, a word with the maid at Bloomsbury on the subject of umbrellas." Bloomsbury received them again with velvet, which always gave Whimsy the sense of offending a widow by walking on her cushions. The maid, Ellen, a sensible girl with the useful habit of looking at one's face before answering, appeared at Bunter's quiet request. Whimsy affected the manner of a forgetful gentleman seeking to repair a social solecism. "I am ashamed," he said, "to confess that my mind, being an ill-kept attic, has mislaid a trifle. Mr. Venn habitually carried an umbrella on his morning rounds." "Yes, my lord, the black one. He was very particular. Black silk, straight malacca, no silver, somewhat austere." "Oh, I know him," said Whimsy. "And this morning?" "The brown one, my lord." "Ah," said Whimsy, as though the sun had generously appeared in November. "And why the brown?" Ellen hesitated. "The black had a loose rib yesterday, my lord. He told me to put it by the scullery for the mender. I did. The brown was in the stand." "So Mr. Venn left with the brown," said Whimsy. "Was it ever used, to your knowledge?" "Not much, my lord." "It belonged to the mistress's brother. He left it when he stayed and never sent for it. Mr. Venn said it was too showy." "Showy?" murmured Whimsy, noting the discreet silver band he had admired. "A dandy among protections, and this morning he took it. Did he remark upon it?" "No, my lord, only that he'd be back at 8:20 for eggs." "Which, alas," said Whimsy gently, "have grown melancholy waiting. Thank you, Ellen. You will have done the house a great service by remembering so clearly." Back in the street, Whimsy let the monocle drop and dangle. It was not his umbrella, Bunter. He disliked it. He intended the black. The black being indisposed, he took the brown. Somebody who cannot rely on Providence may have relied upon that. Consider the fracture near the lower joint, where a weakness might be expected in a stranger's hand. And the bend upon the handle. How do you bend a horn handle, Bunter? "By forcing it across a rail, my lord," said Bunter promptly, "or the edge of a bench." "Just so," said Whimsy. "The sort of bench one finds by a lake in St. James's Park, the sort of rail one grips if he is angry or frightened. Our argument, then, may have been physical in everything but name. We will not be grateful to coincidence. It has ruined too many good novels. Let us seek Mr. Horace Venn before he has time to tidy his conscience. If he is innocent, he will talk. If he is guilty, he will talk longer." Bunter, who believed in Providence when properly directed, already had a cab in motion. As they entered, Whimsy, with that lightness which made his gravity convincing, added, "And ask Parker to discover, like a virtuous fairy, whether any gentleman with a pale scarf and a moral deficit has taken lately to walking at 7 o'clock by the water. There is a woman in a green coat. I do not yet know whether she is the past, the present, or the future, but she will do for a colour plate." The cab turned east, and the park behind them resumed its innocent industry. The cab deposited Whimsy and Bunter before a square of Bloomsbury terraces whose facades carried the weary dignity of men obliged to wear frock coats long after fashion has condemned them. Number 37 announced itself in brass letters rather badly polished, and a row of lace curtains that looked as though they had absorbed too many years of coal dust and scandal in equal measure. Bunter performed the necessary inquiries with a gravity that persuaded the door to open almost of its own accord, and presently the nephew, Mr. Horace Venn, appeared, slim, nervous, and with a smile that had learned to apologize before the lips moved. "Lord Peter Whimsy," Horace repeated, as though the syllables belonged to a chapter of some book he had never finished reading. "I heard you'd taken an interest. Please, though I hardly know why you should trouble yourself, do come in." The drawing-room bore the unmistakable scent of smoke disguised with cheap cologne. A pile of ledgers squatted upon a side table, their bindings cracked by debts. Horace flung himself into an armchair and attempted nonchalance with the assistance of a cigarette, which immediately betrayed him by trembling in his fingers. "You quarrelled with your uncle last night," said Whimsy, very gently, as though discussing the weather in Florence. Horace gave a short, bitter laugh. "Everybody knows that by now. I dare say the maid has embroidered it beautifully. Yes, I lost my temper. He was a hard man, hard as oak and twice as gnarled. He accused me of throwing away the family name, and I told him he'd never understand a modern career. Stocks, trade, speculation. He called it gambling, as if he'd never touched a risk in his own life. The truth is, he meant to cut me off." "Which, by the way, did he?" Horace flushed. "Not altogether, but he meant to reduce my allowance. He said I was to stand or fall on my own feet. 'Fall,' he said, 'and it will be sooner than you think.' It was damned prophetic of him." Whimsy toyed with his cigarette case, offering one to Horace with the unruffled politeness of a man extending rope to a drowning swimmer. "And so you went away at what hour?" 11. He wouldn't listen further. "I went to my rooms in Holborn. There were people there, fellows from the club, ready to swear to it." "Punctual alibis," murmured Whimsy. "Useful coin in a dubious market. Did you see your uncle this morning?" "Certainly not." Horace's eyes flashed. "I didn't even know he was dead until I read the news sheets. For God's sake, do you think I'd follow him to St. James's Park with an umbrella?" "I think nothing so indelicate," said Whimsy sweetly. "But speaking of umbrellas, was the brown one familiar to you?" "The brown? He never carried it. Hated it. Said it was too dashing. Belonged to Uncle's brother-in-law, a fellow with a taste for bright colours. Uncle sneered at it. Why? What does it matter?" "It matters," said Whimsy, "because this morning the brown umbrella was his companion." "Why did he change his mind, or who changed it for him? You see the significance?" Horace's face tightened. "You mean someone contrived it? Slipped it into his hand? That would be monstrous. But why on earth should anyone care which umbrella he carried?" "Why indeed?" said Whimsy, almost to himself, and let the silence stretch long enough to measure the young man's unease. At last Horace sprang up, restless. "Look here, Lord Peter, I'm no saint, but I didn't kill him. I may have hated him last night, but this morning I wasn't anywhere near. Ask the men at the club. I couldn't have done it." Whimsy rose, offering his hand with sudden warmth. "My dear boy, never defend yourself too earnestly. Guilt persuades, innocence merely states. We will leave it at that. Come, Bunter, we must—" "Allow Mr. Venn his cigarette." Outside, Bunter observed, "A nervous gentleman, my lord, though scarcely the hand for so clean a break upon a horn handle." "True," said Whimsy. "Horace's fingers tremble even when the cigarette consents to burn. No, if there is violence in that young man, it expresses itself in shouting, not in fractured canes. Still, Anger at inheritance has sharpened more weapons than steel. Keep him in the ledger, Bunter, but do not write him up in capitals." They turned their steps towards Scotland Yard, where Charles Parker awaited them with his usual air of patience, learned from parish registers. Parker was a man who took notes as monks took vows, slowly, scrupulously, and with an undertone of prayer. "You've seen the body," said Wimsey, without preamble. "Yes," said Parker. "The doctor's report says heart failure with collapse onto the gravel. The umbrella is described but not examined. Accidental breakage." "It's not convincing. I've requested an independent analysis." "Bless you," said Wimsey. "Independent analyses are the only sort worth having. Tell me, Charles, do you remember Miss Bligh's lady in the green coat?" "I do," said Parker. "We've been making inquiries. A Mrs. Welland, widow, lodging in Queen Anne's Gate. She admits she was in the park at that hour, claims she was merely waiting for a friend. No connection, she says, but the colour was too neat," finished Wimsey. "There is never a green coat without a meaning. What sort of woman is Mrs. Welland? Not young, not old, 35 perhaps, composed, well-dressed, slightly theatrical, though not in a vulgar way. She said she disliked to be questioned, which I dare say is natural. But there was something withheld," murmured Wimsey. "The mark of every decent witness. Did she happen to carry an umbrella?" "A green parasol," said Parker. "Closed, no mud." "How unfashionably unhelpful," sighed Wimsey. "Still, parasols have been known to conceal more than shade. Did she know the deceased?" "She denies it." "And she may be telling the truth," said Wimsey. "But truth, like port, requires decanting. We must leave her to stand until the sediment shows." They passed into Parker's office, where papers multiplied like fungi. Wimsey stretched in a chair, exhaling smoke into the dusty light. "Charles," he said, "let us be didactic. What do we know? That Mr. Venn carried a brown umbrella not his own, that he opened it briefly for no weatherly reason, that it bore a splash of clay consistent with the lake's margin, that he argued with a gentleman in a pale scarf, that a lady in green lingered with the air of waiting, that he died, officially, of the heart, unofficially, of something less gentlemanly. What, therefore, is wanting?" "The motive?" said Parker. "Excellent. And who provides us with motive? Horace, who stands to gain and has quarrelled, the mysterious gentleman in scarf who has no identity, or Mrs. Welland, who insists upon none. What we require is a reason for the umbrella." Parker leaned back, narrowing his eyes. Could it be that the umbrella itself was tampered with? "My dear Charles," said Wimsey, "you elevate suspicion to art. Suppose the shaft were weakened beforehand so that at a convenient tug it would break. Then the umbrella becomes a trap, a stage property in a play of collapse. What a delightful conceit! But what purpose does it serve? To make death look accidental, to supply confusion, or to provide a weapon that leaves no mark?" Parker considered. "It could be forced against the chest, an edge pressed suddenly." "And the heart succumbs assisted by shock," finished Wimsey. "Yes, not a stabbing, but a thrust, a murder by pressure, concealed under the respectable disguise of an umbrella. Neat, so neat that the coroner prefers to call it accident, but we shall see." At that moment Bunter entered quietly, as though reluctant to intrude upon a sermon. He laid upon the desk 2 envelopes, labelled in his precise hand. "Samples, my lord, the clay from the umbrella and from the lake's margin. They are identical. There is also a fibre clinging to the rib, a pale wool of the sort used in scarves." "Charles," cried Wimsey, delighted, "here is your pale scarf reappearing like Banquo's ghost. Fibres, clay, umbrellas, quarrels, ladies in green. We shall be positively spoiled for choice. Arrange, my dear fellow, to learn who among Mr. Venn's acquaintances favours a pale wool scarf." bankers, speculators, perhaps even theatrical gentlemen. Meanwhile, I have a fancy to return to the park this evening, a place where arguments occur by shrubbery may yield further confessions in the twilight." Parker nodded gravely. "I'll circulate inquiries. And the nephew?" "Let him simmer," said Wimsey. "If he be guilty, his conscience will boil over. If innocent, his creditors will do it for him. Either way, he will be useful." As dusk settled upon London, Wimsey and Bunter returned once more to St. James's Park. The lamps flickered into pale globes, shadows stretched across the paths. A bench by the lake, dark with damp, seemed to wait for its actors. Wimsey sat with the posture of a man enjoying music that only he could hear. "Bunter," he murmured, "crime is a symphony played in wrong keys. One listens for the discord. Tonight, perhaps, the player will return to the instrument." And indeed, as the hour grew later, a slim figure in a pale scarf approached the bridge, pausing to light a cigarette. Behind, not far, a woman in a green coat loitered, glancing nervously towards the water. Wimsey's monocle gleamed as though saluting them both. "The theatre resumes," he whispered, "and we are the audience until the curtain rises." The slim figure with the pale scarf lingered by the Steter bridge, striking his match 3 times before Flame consented to live. In that repeated gesture was an irritability curiously out of keeping with the languid way he exhaled the smoke afterward, as though he wished the world to understand that he was impatient but elegant. Wimsey, seated on the damp bench with Bunter discreetly behind, raised his monocle like a signal lamp. You observe, Bunter, the peculiar affectation of waste, matches in triplicate. Either he is careless or nervous, and neither habit is healthy in a witness to sudden death. Bunter's voice was subdued. "Yes, my lord, and the lady in green, she has not removed her eyes from him." The lady, Mrs. Welland, if Parker's information could be trusted, had taken up position not 20 yards away, ostensibly admiring the reflections of lamplight on water. Her hands twisted the handle of her parasol with the same restless persistence as the man's fingers fumbled with his cigarettes. 2 strangers feigning unconnected leisure, yet chained by a thread invisible. Wimsey rose suddenly, strolled with apparent aimlessness across the gravel, and paused beneath the very lamp where the scarfed gentleman leaned. "Pardon me," said Wimsey cheerfully, "but have you a light?" "I have always thought 3 matches in succession were unlucky, though in this case I observe they may be merely extravagant." The man turned, startled, but recovered with a faint smile. "Certainly, though I should think luck plays little part in this weather." He held the flame, steady now, toward Wimsey's cigarette. His features, caught by the glow, were thin, the cheekbones too sharp, the eyes too watchful. "Thank you," said Wimsey, inhaling delicately. "I fancy we may have passed this way before, though perhaps I mistake. Were you here yesterday morning?" The man stiffened. "I may have been. Why?" "Because a gentleman of your distinguished scarf was seen in conversation with the late Mr. Venn shortly before his unfortunate demise." Wimsey's tone was light, almost playful, but the words dropped with precision. The man's gaze flickered once toward the woman in green. She shifted, as if preparing to retreat. Wimsey turned casually and called across the water, "Madam, you may as well join us." The air grows chill for solitary reflection. Mrs. Welland approached with a composure that looked rehearsed. Her voice, when she spoke, had the firmness of a woman used to stage audiences. "I hardly think I am obliged to account for my walks, Lord Wimsey." "Quite right," said Wimsey, "but when 3 people take an interest in the same stretch of gravel at the same odd hour, I am moved to suspect a choir rather than soloists. Permit me the conceit." The man ground out his cigarette. "You exaggerate. I exchanged a word with the old gentleman. Yes, he stumbled, dropped his umbrella, clumsy thing, and I helped him up. That's all." "Ah," said Whimsy, "but you see, the umbrella did not survive the interview. It emerged broken, and Mr. Venn rather more so. Might one know your name?" The stranger hesitated a fraction too long. Mrs. Welland interposed smoothly. "This is Mr. Jerome. He is a friend of mine. I asked him to meet me here, quite innocently. We had no part in Mr. Venn's accident." Whimsy inclined his head. "Indeed. But innocence, like charity, flourishes best in daylight. Perhaps we might all adjourn to a more official parlour. Scotland Yard, say, my friend Inspector Parker, is a capital listener." Jerome muttered something inaudible, but Mrs. Welland laid a hand upon his arm. "Very well," she said. "We have nothing to conceal." The little procession moved eastward, Whimsy chatting amiably about architecture while Bunter followed like a silent ghost. At the yard, Parker received them with raised brows. "So soon?" "So soon," said Whimsy. "Our pale scarf has acquired a name, Jerome, and Our Lady in Green a companion. They insist on innocence, which is the first step toward credibility. Perhaps you will put the questions, Charles, while I smoke your cigarettes and admire the police furniture." The interrogation began with formalities. Jerome gave his full name, Henry Jerome, clerk in a firm of brokers. Mrs. Welland confirmed she was a widow lodging nearby. Their story, told in fragments that overlapped too conveniently, was that they had arranged a meeting by the park for private conversation, fearing the gossip of neighbours. They admitted seeing Mr. Venn, admitted speaking briefly, but insisted that his collapse was sudden, without warning, and wholly unassisted. "And the umbrella?" asked Parker. "I saw it fall," said Jerome quickly. "It snapped as he dropped. I scarcely touched it." "Yet," murmured Whimsy, "fibres of pale wool are found clinging to its ribs. One wonders how." Jerome flushed. "Perhaps, when I helped him, my scarf brushed it. That is no crime." "No crime," said Whimsy gently, "but an intimacy. Umbrellas are usually shy of strangers. Why should Mr. Venn, a punctilious gentleman, have allowed you so near?" "Unless you compelled it." Mrs. Welland broke in, her voice low but firm. "Lord Whimsy, you make too much of trifles. My friend was with me. He is not a violent man. Mr. Venn collapsed of his own heart, I am certain." Parker exchanged a glance with Whimsy. The widow's composure was remarkable, her loyalty conspicuous. Yet beneath it lay a nervous energy, as though every word concealed another unspoken. When at last they were dismissed, Parker leaned back wearily. "There's motive somewhere, but I can't see it. Jerome is no heir, no relation, Mrs. Welland neither. Why should they care to harm Venn?" "Exactly," said Whimsy. "And yet they hover round his death like moths to a lamp. Consider, Charles, Jerome is a broker's clerk. Horace Venn is a speculator. Mrs. Welland lives on appearances. What if money binds them? What if Mr. Venn threatened exposure? The quarrel of last night may not have been with Horace alone." "You think Jerome and the widow together?" "I think nothing," said Whimsy, smiling. "But I observe. And observation is the seed from which inference grows. Tomorrow, Charles, we shall plough a little deeper. Meanwhile, Bunter, you will make discreet inquiries at Holborn. Learn whether Jerome is in debt, and whether his acquaintance with young Horace Venn extends beyond mere coincidence. As for Mrs. Welland, I will call upon her landlady. Landladies are inexhaustible sources of truth, especially when they believe themselves malicious." That night, Whimsy dined lightly, quoting Horace in Latin until Bunter coughed gently to recall him to English. But his mind was far from ease. The broken umbrella lay in his thoughts like an accusation. If it had been tampered with, then someone had planned carefully, counting on Mr. Venn's substitution of brown for black, counting on his regular walk, counting on an encounter by the lake. The plan was subtle, theatrical, and daring, and it stank of human motive more pungent than chance. The next morning brought fresh tidings. Parker telephoned. Horace Venn had been seen dining 2 nights prior with none other than Henry Jerome. A witness swore to it, a waiter at a modest restaurant near Chancery Lane. Their conversation, overheard in snatches, had been sharp and anxious, full of figures and promises. "Two birds in one trap," murmured Whimsy. "The nephew, the broker's clerk, and a fortune-hunting widow. Dear me, Charles, the chorus grows. But the conductor, where is he?" Parker sighed. If they were in league, why should they kill the uncle? Unless, said Whimsy, the uncle refused to save Horace from ruin, unless Jerome's firm was entangled, unless Mrs. Welland lent more than sympathy. Oh, Charles, the psychology of finance is as murderous as poison. Let us follow the money. Horace's debts, Jerome's accounts, Mrs. Welland's livelihood, all may meet in that broken umbrella. But until we know why it was chosen, we know nothing. And so the case advanced, each clue leading to contradiction, each witness to deeper uncertainty. Yet Whimsy, in the quiet recesses of his mind, heard already the faint, ironic overture of truth beginning to play. It would be a grim music, with umbrella ribs for violins and a broken heart for drum. Morning in Bloomsbury had a way of flattening scandal. Milk carts rattled, children squealed toward schoolrooms, and the faintly greasy scent of fried bread slid out of boarding houses without shame. Yet within number 37 the air was tense, as though every curtain concealed a whisper. Whimsy arrived at 10, hat at an impertinent angle, monocle glimmering like a tiny herald of mischief. Parker had preceded him, and now sat in the drawing-room with Horace Venn, whose face was pale from lack of sleep and excess of imagination. "You insist you know nothing of Jerome," Parker was saying. "Yet a waiter in Chancery Lane remembers you dining with him 3 nights ago." Horace's head snapped up. "That? Yes, I saw him, accidentally. We happened to dine at the same place. He pressed conversation on me. I couldn't avoid him." Whimsy entered with a genial smile, as if he had stepped into a debating society rather than a murder inquiry. "Ah, pressed conversation, like pressed duck, thin slices of sincerity under a weight of sauce. And what did he talk about, pray? The market, the weather, or the probable distribution of your uncle's assets?" Horace flushed angrily. "If you must know, he spoke of shares, mining shares. He offered me a chance to recover some losses. I told him I had no money and no patience. That was the end of it." "End of it?" Whimsy seated himself, crossing his long legs. "I doubt conversations ever end, my dear boy. They simply go underground like drains and reappear elsewhere with a different smell. Jerome appears again, talking to your uncle on his morning walk, and suddenly umbrellas break. Curious continuity, don't you think?" "I don't believe it," cried Horace. "Why should he harm my uncle? They hardly knew each other." "On the contrary," murmured Whimsy. "They may have known each other rather too well. Jerome is a clerk to brokers, your uncle a man of conservative fortune. Perhaps Jerome approached him for assistance, or was employed to lure you into ruin. There are as many ways to rob a man with figures as with a dagger." "Did your uncle warn you against him?" Horace hesitated, biting his lip. He told me to keep clear of fast men and faster schemes. He said I was being gulled by sharpers, but he mentioned no names." "Then he was merciful," said Whimsy softly. "But mercy, alas, has a poor survival rate in London. Tell me, when you left your uncle at 11 on the fatal night, did you return to your rooms directly?" "Yes," Horace muttered. "The fellows at the club can prove it." "Good fellows," said Whimsy. "Fellows at clubs always can. It is their function. Nevertheless, Charles, keep his alibi in your pocket. It may prove as useful as a bent half-crown. No currency, but satisfying to finger." After a few more exchanges, they left Horace to stew in his denials. Outside, Parker tugged at his moustache in thought. He may be innocent, but he knows more than he admits. "They always do," said Whimsy lightly. "The trick is to wait until ignorance grows too heavy to carry, and they let it drop. For the moment, our greater interest lies in Mrs. Welland. A landlady, Charles, is worth 3 inspectors and a fortune in handwriting experts. The landlady of Queen Anne's Gate proved exactly what one expected. Stout, aproned, and in possession of a tongue sharpened by rent collection. She welcomed Whimsy and Parker as though they were parish priests, invited to scold a sinner. "Mrs. Welland," she said, bustling them into a parlour that smelt of boiled cabbage and furniture polish. "Very respectable, sir, I'm sure. Pays regular, dresses well, but a bit, well, flighty, if you take my meaning. Visitors, late hours sometimes. Always says they're business acquaintances. I've seen gentlemen with her, one in particular, thin, pale, with a scarf always round his neck. And once she asked me to keep a parcel for her. Heavy it was and wouldn't let me open it. I didn't pry, but I thought it odd." "Oddness," said Whimsy approvingly, "is the spice of lodging houses. And this scarfed gentleman, was he Mr. Jerome?" "I believe so, sir. She called him Henry. They spoke often in the sitting-room. Arguments too, sharp words. Once I heard her say, 'If Venn won't, someone else must.' That's all I know." Parker scribbled notes, his brow furrowing. "So she had dealings with Jerome, and both had dealings with Horace. It begins to weave." "Quite," said Whimsy, sniffing the air delicately. "And the thread is money, Charles, always money, dressed in a green coat and a pale scarf. Our umbrella may have sheltered more than rain. It may have covered a transaction, interrupted fatally by refusal." They thanked the landlady and withdrew. Outside, the air carried the rumble of traffic and the distant bells of Westminster. Whimsy stopped, tapping his cane on the pavement. "Charles, we must consider the psychology. A man like Venn, rigid, punctual, disdainful of fashion, encounters Jerome and Mrs. Welland by the lake. They press him for something, investment, a guarantee, a rescue for Horace's debts. He refuses. A quarrel ensues. Jerome, in anger or desperation, seizes the umbrella, perhaps already weakened, and thrusts. The heart falters. Death appears natural. Yet the umbrella betrays him with mud and broken ribs. Voila." Parker shook his head. "It sounds plausible, but why lure him to the park? Why not confront him at home?" "Because," said Whimsy, "in the park there are no walls to echo, no servants to overhear. And Venn's morning walk was as regular as the post. One knows where to find him and for how long. It was the ideal stage for an accident. But I suspect one thing more." Whimsy's monocle gleamed mischievously. That Venn was not so much lured as intercepted. They knew his habits and waited. They spent the afternoon examining Jerome's background. The broker's firm where he worked admitted to difficulties, missing funds, accounts unsettled. Jerome was under suspicion, though not yet charged. His connection with Horace Venn, they confessed, was regrettable, but young men in debt were easily tempted. By evening, Whimsy sat once more in his club, a glass of claret before him and Parker across the table. "So you see, Charles," he said, "Jerome had desperation, Horace had resentment, Mrs. Welland had ambition. The 3 notes together make a very ugly chord. But who struck it first?" Before Parker could reply, Bunter approached with the noiseless gravity of a butler announcing judgment. "A letter has arrived, my lord. Delivered by hand, no address." Whimsy slit it open with a fingernail. The writing was hurried, slanting. If you value the truth, come alone to the park at midnight. By the bench. The umbrella was not what you think. A friend. Whimsy chuckled softly. Charles, the theatre insists upon another performance. Midnight in the park by the fatal bench. One wonders whether the friend intends confession or merely curtain. "You'll not go alone?" said Parker firmly. "My dear Charles," said Whimsy, rising with a bow. "I never go alone. I have Bunter, and you, if you insist upon playing chorus. Midnight, then, the hour when umbrellas are folded and truths are opened." And so the game moved, quietly, toward its next act, the shadows lengthening across St. James's Park, as if to prepare a stage for revelation. Midnight in St. James's Park is not the hour for sentiment. The lamps droop in their iron collars like tired sentries. The water laps without conviction against its stone margins, and the geese, those noisy critics of daylight, mutter in their sleep like disgruntled parishioners. Lord Peter Whimsy, wrapped in his long coat, strolled lightly down the gravel path with Bunter gliding 3 paces behind. From the Admiralty clock a stroke rang out, solemn, deliberate, almost judicial. "Observe, Bunter," murmured Whimsy, "the hour has chimed, and yet our correspondent has not materialized. Either he is unpunctual, which would argue innocence, or dead, which would argue melodrama." They reached the bench. It lay pale under the lamplight, its iron arm curving like a blackened claw. Whimsy tapped it with his cane. "Here we are, the confessional of London. Now we must wait for our priest or our penitent." They waited. The park at that hour was neither empty nor wholly safe. A pair of constables passed, raising their lanterns but offering no comment on Whimsy's presence. A stray drunk wandered along the path, muttering of kingdoms. Bunter remained motionless, the very model of discretion, while Whimsy hummed an aria under his breath. At 10 minutes past the hour, a figure emerged from the shadow of the shrubbery, slim, hesitant, wrapped in a long coat that swung loosely around the knees. It was Mrs. Welland. Her green coat was replaced by something darker, but her silhouette was unmistakable. "You came?" she said softly, almost accusingly. "I wasn't sure you would." "My dear lady," said Whimsy, bowing, "when a friend writes me mysterious notes, I am always punctual. It is one of the few virtues in which I indulge." She glanced about nervously. "You must keep your man back." "Bunter," said Whimsy, "go and admire the ducks." If any villainy is afoot, they will appreciate the Company. Bunter withdrew to the far edge of the lake, leaving the two in the lamplight. Mrs. Welland clasped her hands tightly. "I cannot endure it," she said. "They think I am guilty. Perhaps I am, but not of murder." "Then of what?" asked Whimsy, gently. She drew a trembling breath. "Of foolishness, of desperation. Jerome, Horace, they used me. I was only the bait." "Ah," said Whimsy, "and the fish was your late neighbour, Mr. Venn. Tell me how the line was cast." She hesitated, then spoke quickly, as if afraid her courage would fail. "Jerome told me that Mr. Venn had the power to save Horace from ruin. He said if I could persuade Venn to meet them privately, away from servants, he would listen. I agreed. I asked Venn to come to the park. I met him by chance once before, and he had been courteous. I told him I wished to discuss a matter of charity." "Very touching," murmured Whimsy. "And did he come willingly?" "He was suspicious, but I begged. He agreed only to walk by the lake. He said it would be 10 minutes, no more. When Jerome arrived, they argued. Horace came a moment later. I was frightened. Venn refused them both. He said he would expose their schemes. Then Jerome seized the umbrella. She shuddered. Whimsy's monocle glittered. Describe, if you can, how he used it." He caught it in both hands, pushed it hard against Ven's chest. It snapped. Ven gasped, clutched at his heart and fell. Jerome cried out that it was an accident. Horace swore me to silence. They said no one would believe a woman, and I ran. Whimsy watched her carefully. "And the letter?" "I wrote it," she whispered, "because I cannot bear the weight. But I am afraid. If Jerome knows—" At that instant, a movement stirred in the shadows. Another figure detached itself from the trees, Jerome himself. His pale scarf glimmered faintly under the lamps. "So," he said coldly, "you've betrayed us." Mrs. Welland gave a cry. Whimsy raised a hand. "Steady, steady. We mustn't disturb the ducks." Jerome's face was set, his voice taut with fury. "She lies. She's weaving some tale to save herself. Ven collapsed of his heart, that's all. The umbrella broke when he fell. She's trying to put the blame on me." "And the fibre from your scarf on the ribs?" asked Whimsy mildly. Jerome faltered. "A mistake. It brushed when I bent to help him. That proves nothing." "Indeed," said Whimsy, "but perhaps this will." He nodded. From the darkness beyond, Parker emerged with two plainclothes-men, having trailed Jerome at Whimsy's request. Jerome started violently, realizing the trap too late. "Confession is a delicate wine," said Whimsy, "best taken when the palate is unguarded. Mrs. Welland has provided us with the vintage. You, sir, have merely uncorked it by your appearance." Jerome turned, as if to flee, but the officers closed in. He cursed under. His breath, the veneer of elegance gone. "Damn you all, yes, I pushed him, but it wasn't meant to kill, only to frighten. He should have yielded." "Yet hearts," said Whimsy gravely, "are notoriously unreliable under pressure. You gambled, Mr. Jerome, and the stake was too high. A familiar habit of yours, I gather." They led him away, muttering, leaving Mrs. Welland trembling on the bench. Parker remained, solemn as ever. "You manoeuvred that neatly, Peter, but do you believe her? She may have shaped her tale to spare herself." "Of course she shaped it," said Whimsy, "but within the shape lies truth. Jerome's fury confirmed it, and Horace, poor Horace, is implicated whether he raised his hand or not. The umbrella was the instrument, Jerome the wielder, Horace the beneficiary, and Mrs. Welland the lure. A quartet, Charles, playing a discordant symphony." Mrs. Welland looked up, tears glinting in her eyes. "Will they condemn me too?" "That depends," said Whimsy softly, "on how well you sing to the magistrates. But take comfort. You have at least chosen honesty at the right performance. The curtain will not be so heavy for you as for him." Bunter rejoined them, immaculate even at midnight. "If I may observe, my lord," he said, "this affair has demonstrated once again the unreliability of umbrellas. They protect neither from weather nor from conscience." "True, Bunter," said Whimsy, with a weary smile. "And yet they make charming clues. Charles, let us leave the park to its geese. I feel the urge for coffee, black, strong, and innocent." They turned away together, leaving the bench silent once more, its iron arm glistening faintly in the lamplight like a reminder of the hand that had bent it. For Whimsy, the case was not quite ended. Threads remained to be tied: Horace's precise role, Mrs. Welland's complicity, the financial web beneath it all. But the heart of the riddle had broken open like the shaft of the umbrella itself. The rest, though tedious, would follow. As they walked back into the sleeping city, Whimsy hummed again, quietly, a few bars of Bach, and under the music ran his dry murmur. The curious case of the broken umbrella, curious, but not inexplicable. Logic, Charles, always logic, even when dressed in mud and silver bands. The night wind stirred, scattering a few leaves across the empty path. The stage was cleared, the play concluded, for now. The following morning broke grey and damp, as if London had tired of the drama and preferred to hide itself under a blanket of mist. Wimsey, however, was in high spirits. He took breakfast in his Piccadilly flat with unusual relish, discoursing to Bunter upon the deplorable modern tendency to use margarine instead of butter. "It is a crime, Bunter, against palate and providence, more insidious than murder, for it attacks civilization at the breakfast table." "Yes, my lord," murmured Bunter gravely, pouring coffee, with a hand steady enough to comfort entire nations. The newspaper lay unfolded beside the plate, its headlines already screaming of "Arrest in the Park Mystery." Jerome's name appeared prominently, while Mrs. Welland was described in gentler, if more ambiguous terms. Horace Venn, naturally, was mentioned with suspicion, but without charge. "Observe," said Wimsey, tapping the column, "how the press delights in a pale scarf." One can almost hear the sub-editor saying, "Gentlemen, the public adores a picturesque accessory." I dare say if the fellow had worn galoshes, case would have been dubbed "the curious case of the muddy boots." Bunter refrained from comment, having long ago mastered the art of silence as an instrument of service. At 10 o'clock Inspector Parker arrived, looking as though he had not slept. He accepted coffee gratefully and spread his own notes on the table. "We have Jerome in custody," he said. "He's admitted to the thrust with the umbrella, though he insists he never meant to kill. He says it was an accident, a shove in anger. That much corroborates Mrs. Welland's tale. But here is the twist. Jerome swears Horace begged him to do it." Wimsey's eyes lit. "Ah, the nephew's hand upon the puppet strings. Did Jerome give details?" "He claims Horace promised money, said he'd share the inheritance if Jerome helped frighten the uncle into compliance. They didn't intend murder, only to break his will, so to speak." Parker's tone was grim. "It sounds plausible, but Jerome's word is self-serving. He wants to drag Horace down with him." "Quite so," said Wimsey, buttering toast with careful strokes. "Yet a lie often drags truth after it, like seaweed on an anchor. We must consider, did Horace truly seek his uncle's ruin, or is Jerome merely playing his last card?" Parker leaned forward. "The difficulty is evidence. Horace denies all. He admits quarrelling, but insists he left the plotters before anything was settled. Mrs. Welland claims Horace arrived late, after the fatal thrust. Her account shields him, though it may also shield herself. What do you make of it?" "I make of it," said Wimsey, "a puzzle fit for Euclid. Draw 3 points, Horace, Jerome, Welland. Connect them with lines of debt, ambition, and desperation. Now place Mr. Venn at the centre, like a geometrical truth, immovable, immalleable. The figure collapses naturally. Someone must bear the blame. Our task is to decide who." Bunter entered with a discreet cough. "If I may, my lord, I have further information. Mr. Jerome was deeply indebted to his firm. Certain accounts show losses exceeding £500, money untraceable. Rumour suggests Mr. Venn discovered this and threatened exposure." "Capital, Bunter," said Wimsey. "So Jerome had motive, independent of Horace. Yet if Horace was promised salvation through Jerome's schemes, he may have been entangled as well. The noose, Charles, is woven of 2 ropes. They resolved to interview Horace again. At Bloomsbury, they found him pacing his drawing-room like a fox in a too small pen. His eyes darted nervously from Parker to Wimsey. "Why are you hounding me?" he burst out. "I didn't touch my uncle. Jerome's lying. He always was a liar." Wimsey regarded him with melancholy courtesy. "Mr. Jerome asserts that you invited him to press your uncle, perhaps not to kill, but to terrify. You offered him a share of the inheritance. What say you?" "It's false. I might have spoken in anger, I don't know, but I never meant—" "Good God, do you think I'd plan to kill?" "Anger," said Wimsey, "is an unruly advocate. One says in wrath what one hopes later to forget. Yet words, like umbrellas, have an awkward way of snapping at the wrong moment. Did you or did you not meet Jerome and Mrs. Welland at the park that morning? Horace's face blanched. I went. I admit it. But I arrived after. He was already on the ground, my uncle. Jerome swore it was a seizure. Mrs. Welland was hysterical. They begged me not to speak. I panicked. Panicked, echoed Parker. And did nothing? Horace's voice sank. I was afraid. If I told, they'd accuse me too. You don't know how it feels. Always in debt, always despised by him. I thought silence was safer. Whimsy studied him with cool detachment. Safer? Perhaps, but silence is seldom clever. It is like trying to keep dry under a broken umbrella. It convinces no one and leaves one soaked all the same. Afterwards, in the cab, Parker muttered, He's weak, but I can't tell if he's guilty. Guilt, said Whimsy, is rarely pure. Horace may not have planned the thrust, but his consent lingers like smoke after fire. We must test it against fact. Did he profit? Did he pay debts? Did he correspond with Jerome beforehand? Letters, Charles, letters are the true skeletons in family cupboards. By afternoon, Bunter's inquiries bore fruit. A bundle of papers, retrieved discreetly from Jerome's rooms, contained notes of figures and initials. Among them was HV-200 by Friday. Horace Venn, said Parker grimly. He owed Jerome money. Precisely, said Whimsy. Therefore Jerome held him in leash. It does not prove conspiracy to murder, but it proves dependence. And dependence, Charles, is the mother of temptation. They sat in Parker's office as dusk crept over the city, the windows reflecting a smudged skyline. Whimsy toyed with a matchstick, balancing it on his fingertip. Picture it, he said, softly. Jerome and Horace drowning in debt. Mrs. Welland lured by promises of fortune. Mr. Venn, stern and unyielding, they confront him by the lake. Jerome loses temper, seizes the umbrella, pushes hard. The shaft breaks, the heart breaks, the man falls. Panic. They hush it up, call it accident. Horace keeps silence for fear of implication. Mrs. Welland flees, tormented by conscience. The tale fits. But, Parker objected, there is still no direct proof against Horace. True, said Whimsy. And the law requires proof, not merely elegance. Yet I fancy Horace's own nerves will betray him. We must provide the right stage. The next day, Whimsy arranged a curious experiment. In a small chamber at the yard, before Parker, Bunter, and a clerk, he produced the broken umbrella itself, carefully mended at the shaft but still fragile. He placed it upon the table. Gentlemen, he said, let us recreate. Mr. Horace, will you kindly show us how Jerome pressed this against your uncle, merely as demonstration? Horace recoiled. I can't. I wasn't there. But you said you arrived after and saw, then you can describe. Whimsy's voice was mild but insistent. Horace hesitated, reached, then drew back. Sweat sprang on his forehead. No, I won't touch it. Curious, said Whimsy softly. Jerome, when questioned, had no scruple in demonstrating. Why should you shrink unless the touch recalls more than you wish? Horace's composure crumbled. He cried out, I didn't mean it. I only told him to frighten Uncle. I never thought it would kill. He sank into a chair, head in hands. Parker exhaled slowly. That's as near a confession as we'll get. Yes, said Whimsy, eyes grave. The boy is guilty of counsel, if not of deed. The law will decide whether that is enough, but morally, Charles, he carries a share of the umbrella's weight. Outside, as they left, the evening rain began to fall, soft and persistent. Whimsy raised his own umbrella, black and uncompromising. He glanced up at its ribs, intact and sheltering. You see, Charles, he said, even umbrellas have characters. Some betray, some protect, and some, like our brown friend, are chosen for murder. Curious, isn't it, how the commonplace object becomes the key to human folly? Parker nodded wearily. And the case? Near its end, said Wimsey. But the epilogue remains, the faltering of the culprit, the tidy bow of justice. Without that, no play is complete. And as they walked into the rain, Wimsey quoted softly, with his wry smile, Quis custodiet ipsos custodes? Who will guard the guardians themselves? The city, muffled in drizzle, gave no answer. Rain lingered over London like a guilty conscience. It drizzled along the roof slates, dripped mournfully through gutters, and left the pavements shining with a dull, pewter sheen. Wimsey, who professed to love rain because it provided the perfect excuse for indolence, was nevertheless out in it, striding briskly towards the yard. Parker had summoned him with an urgency that promised either revelation or bureaucratic tedium. Inside the inspector's office, the air was close with the odour of wet coats and stale tobacco. Parker looked grave. Spread across his desk was a sheaf of documents bound with police tape. He gestured Wimsey to a chair. "These," said Parker, "are Jerome's account books. We've traced money movements that tie him directly to Horace Venn. Look, this entry, HV, 200 by Friday, is repeated. Jerome was financing Horace's speculation, probably at usurious rates. In return, Horace hinted at inheritance, urged him to keep pressing the uncle. Precisely the rope of which I spoke, said Wimsey, balancing his monocle like a pendulum. Horace dangled it, Jerome climbed it, and the whole contraption snapped with the umbrella. But does this give us more than motive? Does it nail complicity? It goes further, Parker replied. Among Jerome's letters we found one draft, never sent but telling. It reads, H insists the old man will yield if pressed. He will see him at the walk. If he refuses, we must act. The brown one will serve. She can manage it. Wimsey's brows rose. The brown one? The umbrella? And she must mean Mrs. Welland. How ingenious. It seems they arranged not only the meeting, but even which umbrella should be in service. Then our poor Mr. Venn, exchanging the black for the brown, walked into their theatre exactly as cast. Jerome admits nothing beyond the push. He denies conspiring with Horace to kill. And Mrs. Welland? She clings to her story that she only brought them together, never intended violence. She insists she fled at the sight of Venn's collapse. Wimsey tapped the draft letter thoughtfully. Yet here she is, named in their plot. Ah, Charles, guilt is like rain. It seeps everywhere, stains even where one hoped to remain dry. The law will decide her fate, but morally she is already soaked. That afternoon they brought Horace once more for questioning. The young man looked shattered, his eyes ringed with sleepless shadows, his hands trembling. Confronted with the draft letter, he collapsed into stammered half-denials. I only said he might be persuaded. I never wanted him dead. I thought a fright would soften him. Jerome twisted my words. Wimsey leaned forward, his tone uncharacteristically severe. My dear boy, you cannot summon wolves and then disclaim their fangs. You asked for pressure. You received violence. That is the arithmetic of desperation. Your uncle was not a man to be frightened. He was a man to resist. And when resistance met weakness, death followed. Horace broke into sobs, half confession, half self-pity. Parker closed the interview with weary finality. Later, in the quiet of his flat, Wimsey reflected with Bunter over a glass of brandy. The play nears its last act. Jerome thrust the umbrella, Horace egged him on, Mrs. Welland opened the stage door. Between them they murdered Aloysius Venn, though only one hand broke the shaft. Bunter, polishing a glass, said gravely, Justice will not treat them equally, my lord. No, sighed Wimsey, but morality has a broader brush. The law may condemn Jerome, may spare Horace, may pity the widow, but in truth each carries a rib of that umbrella in the conscience. Curious, isn't it, Bunter, how a trivial object, purchased for rain, forgotten in a stand, becomes the pivot of human ruin? The trial moved swiftly. Jerome, confronted with the evidence, faltered, denied, then raged. At last he confessed the push, still claiming accident, but the jury heard Mrs. Welland's testimony, read the damning draft, and convicted him of manslaughter with intent. Horace, though censured, escaped formal charge. Weakness is not always a crime in the eyes of the law. Mrs. Welland was reproached, scorned by society, but spared prison. On the day of sentence, Wimsey attended quietly. Jerome stood in the dock, scarf absent now, face pale with the bitterness of collapse. When the verdict was pronounced, he swayed, then muttered, "All for a cursed umbrella." Wimsey, leaving the court, remarked to Parker, "There you have it, Charles, the epitaph of modern crime. Not passion, not poison, but a commonplace accessory. Our age has no taste for daggers, it kills with household goods." "Do you pity him?" asked Parker. "Pity? Perhaps. He was only a shabby little clerk caught in the machinery. But pity does not alter logic. A man pressed an umbrella into another's chest. The heart stopped. He lied and schemed to cover it. That is murder enough. The rest is embroidery." That evening, Wimsey dined alone, turning over the events in his mind. He could not quite shake the image of Aloysius Venn, rigidly punctual, collapsing on the gravel, his brown umbrella broken beside him like a symbol of misplaced trust. He thought, too, of Horace, weak, foolish, but not evil in intent, and of Mrs. Welland, whose ambition had led her into tragedy. When Bunter came in with the coffee, Wimsey murmured, "We live in a curious world, Bunter. Umbrellas, scarves, green coats, these are the props, but beneath them always lies the same old story. Greed, fear, desperation. The Greeks knew it, the Victorians embroidered it, and we, my dear fellow, merely observe it with monocles and police reports." Bunter inclined his head. "Shall I clear the table, my lord?" "Yes, Bunter. And put away the umbrella. I have had enough of umbrellas for one lifetime." The rain had ceased outside. London's pavements gleamed as if freshly washed, but Wimsey knew better. The stains of folly lingered, invisible, long after the downpour passed. Thus ended the curious case of the broken umbrella, logical in its chain, sordid in its motive, ironic in its detail. And Lord Peter Wimsey, with his usual dry smile, closed his notebook upon it, murmuring half to himself, half to posterity, "Fiat justitia ruat caelum." Justice has been done, let the heavens fall, though in this instance I prefer they merely drizzle. The rain had cleared by morning, leaving London wrapped in a pale, uncertain sunshine that glanced off the rooftops and lit the wet cobbles like tarnished silver. Lord Peter Wimsey, seated in his favourite chair at the club, toyed idly with a cigarette he had no intention of lighting. The smoke-room was hushed, a few elderly colonels nodding discreetly over the Times, and a solitary barrister wrestling with the crossword. Bunter, impeccable as ever, hovered at the periphery, his presence as natural as a shadow. Parker arrived shortly after 10, his expression one of weary satisfaction mixed with a faint unease. He sat heavily opposite Wimsey, brushing rain spots from his sleeve, though the sun now shone. "It's done," Parker said simply. "Jerome has been sentenced. 7 years penal servitude. The jury spared him the gallows, taking manslaughter rather than murder. Mrs. Welland has been discharged, though she's ruined socially. As for Horace Venn, he's free technically, though his creditors will have him before long. The estate is tied up in probate, and most of it, ironically enough, goes to distant cousins." Whimsy allowed his monocle to dangle by its cord, a faint smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Ah, the inexorable justice of family law, always distributing to those least prepared for it. So the stage is cleared, the actors sent to their respective fates. And what remains, Charles? Merely the umbrella, like a prop abandoned in the wings. Parker leaned forward. That umbrella was more than a prop. It was the weapon, the clue, the pivot of the whole affair. You saw that from the beginning. No one else believed it mattered. My dear fellow, said Whimsy gently, one must always believe in trifles. Life itself is stitched from them, cracks in clocks, mud on boots, ribs of umbrellas. Murderers, like poets, reveal themselves in details. For a time they sat in silence, listening to the rustle of newspapers and the faint crackle of the fire. Then Parker asked the question that lingered still in his mind. Do you think justice was truly served? Jerome did the deed, but Horace urged it, and Mrs. Welland abetted. Yet only one pays the price. Whimsy considered, gazing into the fire with that odd melancholy that sometimes seized him after triumph. Justice, Charles, is not arithmetic. The law can convict only the hand it sees, not the shadows behind it. Jerome thrust the umbrella, and the law punishes him. Horace will be punished in subtler ways. Poverty, disgrace, the consciousness of his cowardice. Mrs. Welland will be punished by society, which can be crueller than any judge. Each receives, in the end, what the world considers proportionate. Whether heaven agrees is another matter, but we are not consulted. Parker sighed. You speak as if it were all a stage play. Is it not? Whimsy smiled faintly. We strut, we fret, we push umbrellas into one another's chests, and the curtain falls. If I seem flippant, Charles, it is because the alternative is too grim. Better to quote Shakespeare than to brood upon human folly. At that moment, a club servant approached with a telegram. Whimsy slit it open languidly. It contained only a few words. You saved me from despair. Welland. He folded it carefully, slipping it into his pocket without comment. Parker raised an eyebrow. Gratitude? Or confession, said Whimsy lightly. The line between the two is as thin as an umbrella rib. They parted soon after, Parker to his work, Whimsy to a luncheon appointment he had no intention of attending. Instead, Whimsy walked slowly through St. James's Park. The gravel was still damp where Venn had fallen. The bench stood in its place, indifferent, the lake reflecting a sky too pale for comfort. He paused, cane resting lightly against his shoulder, and considered the scene with that detachment of his which was never quite free of irony. A nurse wheeled a pram past, humming. A clerk hurried with papers clutched beneath his arm. No one spared a glance for the place where a man's life had ended. The city forgets quickly, only detectives and widows remember. Bunter appeared beside him as though conjured from the mist. If I might say so, my lord, the case was concluded satisfactorily. Satisfactorily, yes, said Whimsy, but not happily. There is a distinction. Murder never ends happily, Bunter, only neatly. And even neatness is a fragile illusion. Still, it will do. He turned away, lighting at last the cigarette he had been toying with all morning. The smoke drifted upward, dissolving into the thin spring air. Come, Bunter, he said, let us leave umbrellas to honest rain. There is a concert at Queen's Hall this evening, and Bach will play us out more gracefully than any court or jury. Logic may solve crimes, but only music redeems them. And with that, Lord Peter Whimsy, arch, witty, and just faintly weary, strolled on, leaving behind the park, the broken umbrella, and the memory of Aloysius Venn, another man destroyed not by fate, but by the pettiness and desperation of those around him.